Marcus Thompson had never imagined that standing in a mahogany-paneled law office on a rainy Tuesday morning would change his life forever. The 28-year-old construction worker shifted uncomfortably in his work boots, still covered in dust from the morning job site. His calloused hands felt out of place in the pristine environment where everything seemed to cost more than his monthly rent. The lawyer, a stern-faced woman named Helen Kirkwood, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming. I know this must be confusing, but your great-uncle, Richard Ashworth, specifically requested your presence for the reading of his will." Marcus frowned. "I told you on the phone, ma'am. I don't know any Richard Ashworth. You must have the wrong person. I assure you, we don't." Helen opened a thick folder. "Richard Ashworth was your maternal grandmother's brother. He was quite wealthy, as you may have heard in the news." The name suddenly clicked. Marcus remembered seeing headlines about the reclusive billionaire who had died the previous month. Ashworth Industries, real estate empire, mysterious hermit who hadn't been seen in public for decades. But Marcus had never connected him to his own family. "My grandmother never mentioned him," Marcus said slowly. "There was a family dispute many years ago. Your grandmother, Sarah, and Richard had a falling out when they were young. She left home and changed her name when she married. Richard spent his entire life trying to find her, but she had covered her tracks well. It wasn't until after her death that he managed to trace the family line to you." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. His grandmother had died when he was 15, and she had always been secretive about her past. Now he understood why. Helen continued, "Richard Ashworth built an empire worth approximately $2.8 billion. His will is quite unusual, which is why we needed to meet in person." Marcus's heart began to race. Could this mean what he thought it meant? Could he be about to inherit billions? His mind flashed to his cramped studio apartment, his mounting student loans from the trade school he had attended, his aging pickup truck that barely started on cold mornings. Helen pulled out a single sheet of paper and a small envelope. "To Marcus Thompson, the only known heir of my sister Sarah, I leave the sum of $1. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. $1. Not 1 million. Not 1 billion. $1. Helen reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp dollar bill, placing it on the polished table between them. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. The rest of his estate has been left to various charities." Marcus stared at the dollar bill in disbelief. He had never expected anything, but somehow hearing about the billions before learning he would receive $1 felt like a cruel joke. "That's it. $1. There is one more thing." Helen picked up the small envelope. "He left this note for you personally." Marcus took the envelope with trembling fingers. His name was written on the front in shaky handwriting. Inside was a folded piece of paper with just a few lines written in the same unsteady script. "Marcus, I'm sorry for the pain my family caused your grandmother. The real treasure isn't money, it's the truth. Look where the sun sets behind the oak tree on the day we first met." "Uncle Richard," Marcus read the note 3 times, but it made no sense. "What does this mean? What oak tree? We never met." Helen shrugged. "I'm afraid I don't know. Mr. Ashworth was quite specific about his instructions, but he didn't explain them to me." Marcus folded the note and put it in his pocket along with the dollar bill. "So that's really it? $1 and a cryptic note?" "I'm afraid so. I'm truly sorry, Mr. Thompson. I know this must be disappointing." As Marcus walked out of the law office into the drizzling rain, his mind reeled. The media would probably have a field day with this story. Billionaire leaves fortune to charity, gives heir just $1. He could already see the headlines. But something about the note nagged at him. "Look where the sun sets behind the oak tree on the day we first met." His great-uncle claimed they had met, but Marcus was certain they never had. Unless Marcus drove back to his apartment in a daze. He lived in a converted garage behind a small house in a working-class neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was all he could afford on his construction worker's salary. He sat on his narrow bed and pulled out the note again. The paper felt expensive, heavy, and cream-colored. The handwriting was definitely that of an elderly person, but there was something deliberate about it, as if each word had been carefully considered. Marcus had grown up with his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8. Sarah Thompson had been a quiet woman who worked as a seamstress and never talked about her past. She had raised him with love, but very little money, and Marcus had learned early to appreciate the value of hard work. Now, staring at the note, he wondered what secrets his grandmother had kept. Why had she and Richard Ashworth had a falling out? And why had she never mentioned having such a wealthy brother? Marcus pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about Richard Ashworth. The internet was full of articles about the mysterious billionaire, but most of them focused on his business empire and reclusive lifestyle. There were very few personal details. According to the articles, Ashworth had never married and had no children. He had built his fortune in real estate, buying up property all over the country during economic downturns and holding on to it as values increased. He was known for his sharp business sense, but also for his generous charitable donations, though he always gave anonymously. One article mentioned that Ashworth had grown up on a farm in rural Ohio before moving to the city to make his fortune. The farm had been sold decades ago, but Marcus made note of the location. As he read, Marcus began to form a theory. What if the note was referring to his grandmother's childhood home? What if there was something hidden there, something that would explain the family rift, and maybe even provide some additional inheritance? It seemed far-fetched, but Marcus had nothing to lose. He had some vacation time saved up from work, and the location in Ohio was only a 6-hour drive away. The worst that could happen was he would waste a tank of gas and a weekend. The next morning, Marcus called in sick to work and began planning his trip. He packed a small bag, filled his truck with gas, and set off for Ohio. As he drove through the flat countryside, he thought about his grandmother and what she might have been hiding. Sarah Thompson had been a loving guardian, but she had always seemed sad, as if she was carrying some great burden. She had never talked about her childhood or her family, always changing the subject when Marcus asked questions. Now he wondered if her sadness had been connected to whatever had happened between her and Richard. The address from the internet led Marcus to a small town called Millbrook, population 2,847. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest excitement was the annual corn festival, and where strangers were noticed immediately. Marcus stopped at a gas station and asked the elderly attendant about the Ashworth family. The man's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, the Ashworth place. That brings back memories. Old farm about 5 miles east of town. The family left when I was just a boy, but I remember them. There was some kind of trouble, split the whole family apart." "What kind of trouble?" Marcus asked. The attendant scratched his head. "Can't rightly remember the details. Something about money and blame. The parents died young, left the farm to the 2 kids. But they couldn't agree on what to do with it. The boy wanted to sell and invest the money in the city. The girl wanted to keep the farm and the family. They fought something fierce." Marcus felt pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together. What happened to the farm? Boy won in the end. Sold the place and headed off to make his fortune. Girl left town the same day and never came back. Broke a lot of hearts, that did. She was engaged to a local boy, but she just up and disappeared. Marcus's heart sank. So his grandmother had been forced to give up her home and her life because of her brother's ambitions. No wonder she had never spoken of him. "The old farm's still there," the attendant continued. "Been through a few owners over the years. Nice folks live there now, the Hendersons. They fixed it up real nice." Marcus thanked the man and drove east out of town. The countryside was beautiful in the late afternoon light, rolling hills covered with corn fields and pastures dotted with cattle. He could understand why his grandmother would have wanted to preserve this peaceful life. The Ashworth farm was easy to find. It sat on a small hill overlooking a valley, a white 2-story house with a red barn and several outbuildings. The current owners had clearly taken good care of the property. Everything looked freshly painted and well-maintained. Marcus parked by the mailbox and walked up the gravel driveway. A middle-aged woman came out of the house, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "Can I help you?" she asked with a friendly smile. "Hi, I'm Marcus Thompson. I hope I'm not bothering you, but I think my family used to own this farm a long time ago. I was wondering if I could look around a bit." The woman's face brightened. "Oh, how wonderful. I'm Nancy Henderson. My husband Tom, and I bought this place 15 years ago. We love learning about its history. What was your family's name?" "Ashworth. My great-uncle Richard and my grandmother Sarah grew up here in the 1940s and 50s. Nancy gasped. Richard Ashworth, the billionaire who just died. We heard he had grown up somewhere around here. How exciting. Please, come in, come in. Tom will want to meet you. Nancy led Marcus into a comfortable kitchen that smelled of fresh-baked bread. The house was beautifully restored but maintained its old-fashioned charm. Tom Henderson, a tall man with graying hair, came in from the back porch. Tom, this is Marcus Thompson. His family used to own our farm. Tom shook Marcus's hand enthusiastically. Welcome back. We've always wondered about the people who lived here before us. We found some old photos and letters in the attic when we moved in. Would you like to see them? Marcus's pulse quickened. That would be amazing. Tom led him upstairs to a small office where he pulled out a cardboard box. We've been meaning to do something with these, maybe donate them to the Historical Society. But if they belong to your family, you should have them. The box contained dozens of black and white photographs, old letters, and documents. Marcus's hands shook as he lifted out a photo of two children standing in front of the house. The girl looked exactly like his grandmother had as a young woman. The boy was taller, with serious eyes and a confident stance. That's them, Marcus whispered. Sarah and Richard. Tom pointed out the window toward the backyard. There's something else you might be interested in. See that old oak tree out there? According to the previous owners, it's been there for over 100 years. Apparently, it was some kind of meeting place for the family. Marcus looked out the window and felt his heart skip a beat. There, in the backyard, stood a massive oak tree with spreading branches that created a canopy of shade. And, behind it, exactly where the note had said to look, the sun was beginning to set. Could I go out and look at the tree? Marcus asked. Of course, Nancy said. Take your time. We'll be right here if you need anything. Marcus walked out into the backyard, his hands trembling as he pulled the note from his pocket. Look where the sun sets behind the oak tree on the day we first met. But when had they first met? Marcus was certain he had never encountered his great-uncle. As he approached the tree, Marcus noticed something carved into the bark about 4 feet from the ground. The letters were old and partially grown over, but still visible. S+ are forever. Sarah and Richard, brother and sister, promising to stick together forever. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as he imagined them as children, carving their names into this tree and making promises they would never keep. But the note said the day we first met. Marcus studied the carving more closely and noticed something else just below it. A date, June 15, 1987. Marcus's breath caught. June 15, 1987. That was the day he was born. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Richard Ashworth had somehow been present on the day of Marcus's birth. That was their first meeting, even though Marcus had no memory of it. And now he was supposed to look where the sun set behind this tree on that significant day. Marcus walked around the tree, studying the ground and the trunk for any signs of something hidden. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, and Marcus tried to imagine where exactly he should be looking. As he walked around to the far side of the tree, away from the house, Marcus noticed that the ground looked different. There was a slight depression in the earth, as if something had been buried there long ago. The grass grew differently in that spot, thinner and a slightly different shade of green. Marcus looked back at the house. The Hendersons were visible through the kitchen window, giving him privacy while keeping an eye on him. He knelt down and began brushing away leaves and loose dirt from the suspicious area. His fingers hit something hard about 6 inches down. Excited now, Marcus dug more aggressively, using his hands to scoop away dirt and debris. Soon he uncovered the corner of what looked like a metal box. Working carefully, Marcus excavated around the edges of the box until he could lift it free. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of stainless steel and surprisingly heavy. There was no lock, just a simple latch that had held despite decades in the ground. Marcus's heart pounded as he opened the latch. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, were several items that made him gasp in amazement. The first thing he pulled out was a birth certificate. His birth certificate from the day he was born. But this wasn't the copy his grandmother had always kept. This one had additional information filled in, information that Marcus had never seen before. In the space marked Father, where his grandmother's copy said Unknown, this certificate clearly listed a name, David Richard Ashworth. Marcus stared at the document in shock. David Richard Ashworth. Not just Richard Ashworth, but someone with the middle name Richard. And the handwriting looked similar to the note he had received from the lawyer. With trembling hands, Marcus pulled out the next item, a thick envelope full of photographs. These weren't old family photos like the ones in the Hendersons' attic. These were recent pictures, taken throughout Marcus's life from a distance. There was Marcus as a toddler, playing in his grandmother's backyard. Marcus starting school, his grandmother walking him to the building. Marcus graduating from high school, shaking hands with his principal. Marcus at his trade school graduation. Marcus at work on various construction sites. Someone had been watching him his entire life, documenting his growth and achievements from afar. And based on the quality and angles of the photos, it had to be someone with considerable resources. The last item in the box was another letter, this one much longer than the note he had received at the lawyer's office. Marcus unfolded it carefully and began to read in the fading daylight. My dear son Marcus, if you are reading this, then you have found what I hoped you would find, and I am no longer alive to explain everything in person. I pray that you will forgive an old man for the choices he made, even if you cannot understand them. I am not your great uncle. I am your father. Your grandmother Sarah was my sister, but she was also the only person who ever truly understood me. When our parents died and left us the farm, I made a terrible mistake. I was young and ambitious and convinced that selling the farm was the right thing to do. Sarah begged me not to sell our family's legacy, but I wouldn't listen. The fight we had was worse than anything the neighbors could have imagined. I said things that can never be taken back, and Sarah left that very day. She was engaged to a good man named James Thompson, and she went to him for comfort. I made my fortune just as I had planned, but success felt empty without my sister. I tried for years to find her, to apologize and make things right, but she had disappeared completely. She had taken James's name and started over somewhere far away. It wasn't until 1986 that I finally tracked her down. She was living in your hometown, working as a seamstress and about to become a grandmother. You see, your mother Jennifer was Sarah's daughter-in-law, married to Sarah's adopted son Robert. When I found Sarah, she was different. Older, sadder, but also wiser. We talked for hours about the years we had lost. She forgave me, but she also made it clear that she didn't want my money or my help. She had built a good life without me, and she was proud of that independence. But then, tragedy struck. Your parents were killed in that terrible accident, and you came to live with Sarah. She was already in her 70s, working hard to make ends meet, and suddenly, she had an 8-year-old boy to raise. I wanted to help. I begged her to let me provide for you both, to give you the opportunities that my money could buy. But Sarah was stubborn. She said you were her responsibility and hers alone. So I helped in the only way she would allow. Secretly, the scholarship you received for trade school, that wasn't a random award. The bonus checks that sometimes came with your construction jobs, those weren't company profits. The landlord who never raised your rent despite rising property values, he's been receiving compensation from me for years. I have watched you grow into exactly the kind of man your grandmother wanted you to become. Honest, hardworking, independent, and kind. Every achievement in your life has been earned through your own effort, but I have been honored to help smooth the path when I could. Sarah died before I could convince her to let me be part of your life openly. But in her final days, she extracted a promise from me. She made me swear that I would never tell you who I really was while I was alive. She was afraid that knowing about my money would change you, would take away the strength and character that poverty and struggle had given you. But she also understood that you deserved to know the truth eventually. So we made a plan. Marcus had to stop reading as tears blurred his vision. His father, Richard Ashworth, was his father, not his great-uncle. Everything he thought he knew about his family was wrong. He wiped his eyes and continued reading. The inheritance of $1 was Sarah's idea. She wanted to test your character one more time. Would you be bitter and angry about being excluded from my fortune? Or would you be curious enough to investigate, determined enough to solve the puzzle, and brave enough to take action? You have proven yourself once again, my son. Now I need you to return to the law office where this all began. Give Helen Kirkwood the birth certificate and this letter. She has been holding the real inheritance documents. waiting for you to prove that you are truly Sarah's grandson and my son. The billion-dollar empire I built was never meant for me alone. It was always meant to be your inheritance, but only after you had become the man Sarah knew you could be. I love you, Marcus. I have loved you every day of your life, even from a distance. And I am proud of the man you have become. Your father, Richard David Ashworth, P.S. There is one more surprise waiting for you. Sarah may be gone, but she was not the only family member who cared about you. Look in the local phone book for Thompson, James. Your grandfather is still alive, still living in the same house where your grandmother grew up. He has been waiting 60 years for his wife to come home. Perhaps it's time for her grandson to visit instead. Marcus sank to his knees beside the tree where his father and aunt had once carved their names. The sun had set completely now, leaving him in darkness broken only by the lights from the Henderson house. Everything made sense now. The mysterious benefactor who had helped him through the drive back to the city felt different from the journey out to Ohio. Marcus kept glancing at the metal box sitting on the passenger seat, still struggling to process everything he had learned. The dashboard clock showed 2:47 a.m. when he finally pulled into the parking space behind his apartment, but sleep was the last thing on his mind. Inside his small living space, Marcus spread out all the documents on his tiny kitchen table. Under the harsh fluorescent light, the birth certificate looked even more official and shocking. David Richard Ashworth, listed as his father. His grandmother had kept this secret for 28 years. Marcus picked up his phone several times to call the lawyer, then remembered it was the middle of the night. Helen Kirkwood would have to wait until morning. Instead, he found himself staring at the old phone book he had grabbed from the Hendersons' house. Nancy had insisted he take it when he mentioned looking for someone named James Thompson. The book was thin, covering only Millbrook and the surrounding rural areas. Marcus flipped to the T section and ran his finger down the column of names. There it was, Thompson, James, 47, Oak Street. The same Oak Street where his grandmother had grown up, according to the address on the birth certificate. Marcus's hands shook as he dialed the number. It rang 4 times before a gravelly voice answered. Hello, Mr. Thompson? James Thompson. Who's asking? Do you know what time it is? Marcus took a deep breath. Sir, my name is Marcus Thompson. I think you might be my grandfather. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Marcus could hear the old man's breathing, shallow and quick. Sarah, James whispered finally. You sound like Sarah. She was my grandmother. She raised me after my parents died. Another silence, longer this time. When James spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. Is my Sarah still alive? Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. No, sir. She died when I was 15. That was 13 years ago. The sound that came through the phone was part sob, part sigh. I waited, James said. 60 years, I waited for her to come home. Mr. Thompson, I know this is a shock, but could we meet? I just found out about you tonight, and I think there's a lot we need to talk about. You're really Sarah's boy? Her grandson. I have pictures, documents. I can prove it. Then, you come home, James said firmly. You come home right now. Marcus looked around his small apartment, at the life he had built with such effort. I'll be there as soon as I can. The second drive to Ohio felt even longer than the first. Marcus stopped only for gas and coffee, pushing his old truck to make the best time possible. As the sun rose behind him, painting the highway golden, he thought about all the family dinners he had missed, all the birthdays and holidays when it had been just him and his grandmother in their small apartment. James Thompson lived in a white farmhouse on the edge of Millbrook, with a wide front porch and flower boxes under every window. As Marcus pulled into the gravel driveway, the front door opened, and an elderly man stepped out. He was tall and lean, with snow-white hair and eyes the same shade of blue as Marcus's grandmother had possessed. He wore clean work clothes and moved with the careful dignity of someone who had spent his life working with his hands. Marcus got out of the truck and approached slowly. James studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. You have her eyes, he said simply, and her stubborn chin. Come inside, boy. We've got a lot of catching up to do. The interior of the house was like stepping back in time. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but nothing seemed to have been updated since the 1960s. The furniture was solid and comfortable, the kind built to last generations. Framed photographs covered every surface, but Marcus noticed that they all seemed to stop at a certain point in time. James followed his gaze. I stopped taking new pictures after she left. Didn't seem right to document a life she wasn't part of. He led Marcus to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee with the practiced motions of someone who had performed the same ritual for decades. Tell me about her, James said as he worked. Tell me about my Sarah. For the next hour, Marcus shared stories about his grandmother. He told James about her job as a seamstress, how she would stay up late to finish orders so she could attend his school events. He described her small garden where she grew vegetables to save money on groceries, and how she taught him to cook simple, hearty meals. He talked about her quiet strength, her dry sense of humor, and how she never complained even when money was tight. James listened with tears streaming down his weathered face. She was supposed to come back, he said when Marcus finished. After the fight with her brother, she was so angry and hurt. But I thought once she calmed down, once Richard came to his senses and apologized, she would come home to me. Why didn't you go after her? James poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. Pride mostly, and hurt feelings. She left without saying goodbye, just disappeared in the middle of the night. I was young and stubborn, figured if she wanted to go, then good riddance. By the time I realized what a fool I was being, she was gone without a trace. Marcus pulled out the metal box and showed James the contents. The old man's hands trembled as he examined the birth certificate and Richard's letter. So Richard was your father, James said slowly. That explains a lot. Sarah always said you reminded her of someone, but she wouldn't say who. Did you know Richard well? James's expression darkened. I thought I did. We were friends, believe it or not, before everything went wrong. Richard was smart, ambitious, always talking about big plans and bigger dreams. But he was also impatient and sometimes cruel when people didn't see things his way. The letter says he tried to find her for years. Maybe he did. But by then, the damage was done. Sarah was a proud woman, and she didn't forgive easily, especially when it came to family. James stood up and walked to an old wooden cabinet. He pulled out a small box and set it on the table. I've been saving this for 60 years, hoping I'd get the chance to give it to her. Inside the box was an engagement ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the morning light. I never married, James said quietly. Never even dated another woman seriously. I kept thinking Sarah would come back, and I wanted to be here when she did. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the weight of all this lost love, all these wasted years. She never married either. She told me once that she had loved someone when she was young, but it hadn't worked out. James smiled through his tears. She remembered me. She named me Marcus James Thompson. The James was for you. The old man sat down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support him. All these years, I had a grandson. All these years, and I never knew. Marcus reached across the table and took his grandfather's hand. You know now, and I know now. Maybe it's not too late for us to have a family. James squeezed his hand tightly. I'd like that, boy. I'd like that very much. They spent the rest of the morning going through old photo albums and sharing stories. James told Marcus about his grandmother's childhood, about how she had been the smartest girl in school, but also the kindest. He described their teenage romance, the plans they had made for their future, and the devastation he felt when she disappeared. She was going to be a teacher, James said, showing Marcus a picture of a young Sarah in a cap and gown. Had a scholarship to the state college and everything. But when her parents died and she had to take care of Richard, she gave up her dreams to keep the family together. Marcus studied the photograph. His grandmother looked so young and full of hope. It broke his heart to think of all the sacrifices she had made. Richard mentions in his letter that he helped me secretly over the years, Marcus said. Did you know about that? James nodded. I suspected. Your grandmother was too proud to accept help directly, but sometimes strange things would happen. Bills would get paid mysteriously. Opportunities would appear out of nowhere. I always wondered if someone was looking out for you both. Why didn't you ever try to contact us? Once you knew where we were. James was quiet for a long moment. I did try once. About 5 years after Sarah left. I hired a private investigator, found out she was living in the city with a man named Robert Thompson. I thought she had married someone else. Marcus nodded. Robert was her adopted son. my father, technically, though he died when I was young. I didn't know that then. All I knew was that Sarah Thompson was living with a man, and I assumed she had moved on. It nearly killed me, but I decided to respect her choice and leave her alone. Another missed connection, another misunderstanding that had kept the family apart for decades. Marcus wondered how different all their lives might have been if they had just talked to each other instead of making assumptions. At noon, Marcus finally called Helen Kirkwood's law office. The secretary seemed surprised to hear from him so soon after the will reading, but she agreed to schedule an emergency appointment for later that afternoon. I need to go back to the city, Marcus told James. There are legal things I need to take care of, but I want to come back soon, if that's okay with you. James smiled. This is your home now too, boy. You come back whenever you want. As Marcus prepared to leave, James walked out to the truck with him. There's something else, the old man said. Something I probably should have mentioned earlier. Marcus waited, wondering what other surprises this day might hold. Your grandmother wasn't the only one who left town after the fight with Richard. There was another family involved, the Ashworths' closest neighbors. They had a daughter about Sarah's age, a girl named Elizabeth who was engaged to Richard. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. What happened to her? She left the same day Sarah did. See, Richard didn't just break up his family when he insisted on selling the farm. He also broke his engagement to Elizabeth, told her his plans were too big to include a small-town wife. Where did she go? James shrugged. Nobody knows for sure, but there were rumors over the years. Some folks said she went east, to Boston or maybe New York. Others claimed she moved out west. What I do know is that she never came back either, and her family never spoke of her again. Why are you telling me this? Because, James said slowly, if Richard left you his entire fortune, you might not be his only heir. Elizabeth might still be alive, and if she is, she might have children of her own. Children who could challenge your inheritance. Marcus felt his newfound wealth slipping away before he had even claimed it. Do you think she would do that? I don't know. Elizabeth was a sweet girl, but Richard hurt her badly when he left, and 40-year-old wounds have a way of festering. As Marcus drove back toward the city, his mind raced with new worries. It had been overwhelming enough to learn that he was inheriting billions of dollars. Now he had to consider the possibility that someone else might have an equal claim to that inheritance. But more than that, he was troubled by the pattern he was seeing. Richard Ashworth seemed to have hurt everyone he had ever cared about in his pursuit of success. His sister Sarah, his fiancée Elizabeth, even his own son by staying away for 28 years. Was Marcus about to inherit more than just money? Was he also inheriting the responsibility for his father's mistakes? The law office looked different when Marcus returned that afternoon. Helen Kirkwood greeted him with obvious surprise and curiosity. Mr. Thompson, what brings you back so soon? I hope you haven't had any problems with the inheritance. Marcus set the metal box on her desk and opened it carefully. I think there's been a misunderstanding about my inheritance. Helen's eyes widened as Marcus showed her the birth certificate and Richard's letter. She read the letter twice, then examined the birth certificate under a magnifying glass. This is remarkable, she said finally. But I have to ask, why didn't Mr. Ashworth simply update his will to reflect this information? According to the letter, he and my grandmother agreed that I needed to prove myself first. The inheritance of $1 was a test. Helen nodded slowly. That sounds like something Richard Ashworth would do. He was always interested in people's character more than their circumstances. She went to a large safe in the corner of her office and began working the combination. If this documentation is authentic, and I believe it is, then, yes, there are additional inheritance documents. Helen pulled out a thick folder and set it on her desk. This is the real will, the one I was instructed to reveal only if you proved your identity as his son and demonstrated the character traits he was looking for. Marcus felt his heart racing again. What does it say? Let me read the relevant section. Helen put on her reading glasses and opened the folder. To my son Marcus Thompson, if he has proven himself worthy through his actions and character, I leave the entirety of my estate, including Ashworth Industries, all real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid assets. Current estimated value, $2.8 billion. The number hit Marcus like a physical force. $2.8 billion. It was more money than he could even comprehend. However, Helen continued, there are conditions attached to this inheritance. Of course there were conditions. Marcus had learned enough about his father to know that Richard Ashworth never did anything simply. First, you must retain ownership of Ashworth Industries for a minimum of 5 years, though you may hire management to run the day-to-day operations. Second, you must continue the company's charitable giving program, donating at least 10% of annual profits to worthy causes. And third, Helen paused and looked at Marcus seriously. Third, you must attempt to locate and make amends to Elizabeth Morrison, Richard's former fiancée. If she is still alive, you are to offer her $100 million as an apology for the pain Richard caused her. Marcus thought about his grandfather's warning. Elizabeth Morrison could potentially challenge the entire inheritance if she wanted to. Offering her $100 million seemed like a reasonable way to prevent that kind of legal battle. Do we know anything about where Elizabeth Morrison might be? Helen consulted another document. Richard hired private investigators over the years to locate various people from his past. According to their reports, Elizabeth Morrison married a man named Charles Brennan in 1962. She moved to San Francisco and had 2 children. She was widowed in 1998, but remained in California. So she's probably still alive? The last report is from 2019, and she was living in a retirement community in San Jose. She would be in her 80s now. Marcus sat back in his chair, trying to process everything. In the span of 24 hours, he had gone from being a construction worker with $1 to his name to being a billionaire with a grandfather he had never known existed, and a responsibility to track down an elderly woman his father had wronged decades ago. What happens now, he asked. Now we begin the legal process of transferring ownership of the estate to you. It will take several weeks to complete all the paperwork, but you can access some funds immediately for living expenses. Helen handed him a checkbook and a credit card. This account contains $5 million for your immediate needs. Consider it a down payment on your inheritance. Marcus stared at the checkbook. $5 million as pocket money. It was more than he had ever dreamed of having in his entire lifetime. There's one more thing, Helen said. Richard left specific instructions about his funeral arrangements. He wanted a simple service, but he wanted you to be the one to speak about his life. The service is scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Marcus felt overwhelmed again. I don't know what to say about him. I barely knew him. Perhaps that's exactly what needs to be said, Helen suggested gently. Sometimes the most honest words are the most healing. As Marcus left the law office for the second time, his mind was spinning with everything he needed to do. He had to speak at his father's funeral, figure out how to run a billion-dollar company, track down Elizabeth Morrison, and somehow maintain the relationships he was just beginning to build with his grandfather. But underneath all the anxiety and uncertainty, Marcus felt something else, a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. His father had spent his entire life trying to make up for his mistakes. Now it was Marcus's turn to continue that work, to heal the wounds that had divided his family for so many years. The construction worker who had walked into the law office the day before was G. The morning of Richard Ashworth's funeral dawned gray and drizzly, matching Marcus's mood as he stood before the bathroom mirror in his small apartment. He had purchased his first expensive suit the day before, a somber black ensemble that still felt foreign on his body. The construction worker's calloused hands looked strange emerging from crisp white shirt cuffs. Marcus had spent most of the night writing and rewriting his eulogy, struggling to find words for a man who had been both a stranger and the most important person in his life. How do you mourn someone you never knew? How do you honor a father who loved you from a distance for 28 years? The funeral was being held at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, a stately stone building in the city's most affluent neighborhood. As Marcus pulled into the parking lot in his aging pickup truck, he felt out of place among the luxury vehicles that filled the spaces around him. Inside the church, Marcus was surprised to find several hundred people in attendance. He had expected a small, intimate service for a man who had been described as reclusive. Instead, the pews were filled with business associates, employees from Ashworth Industries, and representatives from the various charities his father had supported over the years. Helen Kirkwood met Marcus at the entrance and guided him to the front pew reserved for family. As they walked down the aisle, Marcus could feel hundreds of eyes following his movement. He wondered how many of these people knew about his inheritance. How many were already forming opinions about the unknown son who had inherited billions? "Don't be nervous," Helen whispered as they took their seats. "Just speak from the heart." Marcus nodded, though his stomach was churning with anxiety. He looked up at the ornate stained glass windows and tried to imagine his father attending services here, wondering if Richard had found any peace in this sacred space. The service began with traditional hymns and prayers, but Marcus barely heard them. His mind kept drifting to the letter he had found buried beneath the oak tree, to his father's words about love and regret and second chances. When it came time for the eulogy, Marcus walked to the podium on unsteady legs. He looked out at the sea of faces, all waiting to hear what the mysterious air would say about the man who had shaped their lives in various ways. Marcus pulled out his prepared remarks, then folded them and put them away. Instead, he spoke from his heart. "Most of you knew Richard Ashworth much better than I did," he began, his voice stronger than he had expected. "You worked with him, did business with him, benefited from his generosity. I'm his son, but I only learned that fact 3 days ago." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Marcus could see surprise and curiosity on many faces. "For 28 years, I thought I was alone in the world except for my grandmother. I grew up not knowing that my father was watching over me, helping me in ways I never recognized, loving me from a distance because he thought that was what was best for me." Marcus paused, collecting his thoughts. "I've learned in the past few days that my father made mistakes when he was young. He hurt people he cared about because he was too focused on success and not focused enough on relationships. But I've also learned that he spent the rest of his life trying to make up for those mistakes." He looked directly at several of the charity representatives in the audience. Every dollar he gave away, every life he helped improve through his foundations, those weren't just business decisions or tax strategies. Those were acts of penance, attempts to balance the scales for the pain he had caused. Marcus felt his voice growing stronger as he continued. "My father left me more than money. He left me a lesson about the difference between success and fulfillment, between achieving your goals and earning the love of the people who matter most." He saw several people in the audience wiping their eyes, and he realized his own cheeks were wet with tears. Richard Ashworth built an empire, but he died lonely because he thought wealth was more important than relationships. "I hope I can honor his memory by using what he left me to build bridges instead of walls, to bring people together instead of driving them apart." Marcus looked up at the stained glass window behind the altar, where colored light painted biblical scenes of redemption and forgiveness. "My father spent decades looking for his sister, trying to earn her forgiveness. He spent my entire lifetime loving a son he thought he couldn't be close to. He lived with regrets that ate away at him until the day he died. But he also lived with hope, hope that someday, somehow, his family would be whole again." Marcus's voice cracked slightly as he concluded. "Well, Dad, I'm here now. I understand what you were trying to do, and I forgive you for the years we lost. I promise to use what you've given me to heal the wounds you couldn't heal yourself. Your family is going to be whole again, even if you're not here to see it." The church was completely silent as Marcus returned to his seat. He had spoken for less than 10 minutes, but he felt as if he had run a marathon. Helen Kirkwood squeezed his hand as he sat down. After the service, Marcus was approached by dozens of people who wanted to introduce themselves and express their condolences. Many were employees of Ashworth Industries who seemed genuinely excited to meet their new owner. Others were business associates curious about the company's future direction. But the conversation that affected Marcus most deeply was with an elderly woman who approached him as the crowd was thinning out. "Mr. Thompson," she said in a voice that carried the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. "My name is Rosa Mendoza. I wanted to thank you for what your father did for my family." Marcus shook her hand, noting the strength in her grip despite her advanced age. "What did he do?" 30 years ago, my husband was injured in a construction accident. We had no insurance, no money for medical bills. The hospital was going to turn us away." Rosa's eyes filled with tears at the memory. "But then, a lawyer appeared, said an anonymous donor was going to pay for everything. My husband lived another 25 years because of that kindness." She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn envelope. Every year on the anniversary of the accident, we got a card. No name, just a note saying the donor hoped we were well. I saved them all. Marcus opened the envelope and found dozens of cards, all signed with the same initials. R.A., your father saved my family, Rosa continued. But he never wanted credit, never wanted thanks. He just wanted to help. As Rosa walked away, Marcus realized that this was just one story among probably hundreds. His father had been secretly helping people for decades, using his wealth to solve problems and ease suffering without seeking any recognition. Marcus was still processing this revelation when another woman approached him. She was younger than Rosa, probably in her 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes. Mr. Thompson? I'm Sarah Chun. I'm the director of the Ashworth Foundation. I was hoping we could schedule a meeting to discuss the future of our programs. Marcus nodded. Of course, though I have to admit, I don't know much about running a foundation. Sarah smiled. That's perfectly understandable. The foundation currently manages about $200 million in charitable assets. We fund education programs, medical research, disaster relief, and poverty reduction initiatives around the world. $200 million. Marcus still couldn't wrap his mind around numbers that large. Your father was very hands-on with the foundation, Sarah continued. He personally reviewed every major grant request and often visited the communities we were helping. It was clearly very important to him. What kinds of programs did he support most? Education, mainly. Scholarships for disadvantaged students, funding for trade schools, literacy programs in developing countries. He seemed to believe that giving people the tools to improve their own lives was better than simply giving them money. Marcus thought about his own education at the trade school, the mysterious scholarship that had made it possible. He helped me get through school, didn't he? Sarah nodded. The Marcus Thompson Scholarship Fund was established the year you graduated high school. It's helped over 100 students attend trade schools across the country. Marcus felt overwhelmed again. His father hadn't just helped him secretly. He had turned that help into a program that benefited others. Even his personal gestures of love had been transformed into something larger and more meaningful. I'd like to learn more about everything the foundation does, Marcus said. And I want to understand how Ashworth Industries operates too. I'm going to need a lot of help. Sarah handed him her business card. We're here to support you in any way we can. Your father built something remarkable, and we all want to see it continue. As Marcus finally left the church, his phone rang. The caller ID showed his grandfather's number. Marcus? How did the funeral go, boy? It was enlightening. I learned a lot about the kind of man my father really was. Good things, I hope. Marcus got into his truck and started the engine. Complicated things. He hurt a lot of people when he was young, but he spent his whole life trying to make up for it. I'm starting to understand why grandmother forgave him. Sarah always was wise about people's hearts, James said softly. She could see past someone's mistakes to the person they were trying to become. Grandpa, I want you to come visit me in the city. I want you to see where grandmother lived, where I grew up, and I want to introduce you to some people. I'd like that, Marcus. I haven't been to the city in 40 years, but I think it's time. After ending the call, Marcus sat in his truck for several minutes, watching the last of the funeral attendees drive away in their expensive cars. In a few hours, he would need to report to the Ashworth Industries headquarters for his first day as the company's owner. He would need to meet with executives, review financial reports, and begin making decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars. But first, he had a more personal mission to complete. Using his phone, Marcus searched for information about Elizabeth Morrison Brennan in San Jose, California. It didn't take long to find a listing for Sunset Manor Retirement Community, and when he called and asked for Elizabeth Brennan, the receptionist confirmed that she was a resident. I'd like to speak with her, if possible, Marcus said. My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm calling about Richard Ashworth. There was a long pause. Please hold on, Mr. Thompson. Several minutes passed before a different voice came on the line, elderly, but still strong. This is Elizabeth Brennan. Why are you calling me about Richard Ashworth? Marcus took a deep breath. Mrs. Brennan, I'm Richard's son. He died last week, and he left instructions that I should contact you. The silence that followed was so long that Marcus wondered if the connection had been lost. His son, Elizabeth said finally. I didn't know Richard ever had children. Neither did I, until a few days ago. Mrs. Brennan, I know this is probably painful for you, but Richard left a message asking me to apologize to you for what happened between you two when you were young. Another long pause. 60 years, Elizabeth said quietly. 60 years, and now he sends his son to apologize. I know it's too little, too late. But he also asked me to offer you something, as a way of making amends. I don't want his money, Elizabeth said sharply. I built a good life without Richard Ashworth's money, and I don't need it now. I understand, but maybe we could meet anyway? I'm trying to understand my father, to learn about the people he cared about. You were important to him once. Elizabeth was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might have hung up. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. You sound like him, you know. Richard had that same earnest way of talking when we were young, before ambition made him cruel. Will you meet with me? I suppose. But not to talk about money or apologies. If you want to understand your father, you need to understand the boy he was before he became the man who broke so many hearts. Marcus felt a surge of hope. I could fly out to California tomorrow. Tomorrow is too soon. Give me a few days to prepare myself. This is going to bring back a lot of memories I've spent decades trying to forget. Of course, whatever you need. There's something else, young man. Something you should know before you come out here. What's that? Richard wasn't the only one who made mistakes when we were young. I said and did things that I've regretted ever since. If we're going to talk about forgiveness, it needs to go both ways. After arranging to meet Elizabeth the following week, Marcus drove to his old neighborhood. He parked outside the small apartment where he had lived with his grandmother and sat looking at the building where he had spent most of his childhood. The building looked smaller than he remembered, shabbier, and more run down. It was hard to believe that just a week ago, this had represented the height of his housing ambitions. Now he could afford to buy the entire block if he wanted to. Marcus walked up to the second floor and knocked on the door of his old apartment. A young woman answered, holding a toddler on her hip. Can I help you? Hi, I used to live here. I was wondering if I could look around for just a minute. I'm trying to say goodbye to some memories. The woman looked suspicious, which Marcus understood. He probably looked like he was casing the joint for a robbery. I'm not trying to cause any trouble, Marcus assured her. I lived here with my grandmother until I was 18. She died a few years back, and I just wanted to see the place one more time. Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she stepped aside to let him in. The apartment looked different with someone else's furniture and belongings, but the basic layout was the same. The tiny kitchen where his grandmother had taught him to cook. The living room where they had watched old movies on her small television. The bedroom they had shared until he was old enough to sleep on the couch. Your grandmother lived here? The woman asked. Sarah Thompson. She was a seamstress. The woman's face lit up. Mrs. Thompson. I heard about her from the neighbors. They said she was the sweetest lady, always helping people in the building. Marcus smiled. That sounds like her. Mrs. Garcia downstairs still talks about how your grandmother used to mend clothes for free for anyone who couldn't afford to pay. And during the blackout 5 years ago, she went door to door checking on all the elderly residents. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even after death, his grandmother's kindness was remembered and cherished. As he prepared to leave, the woman called after him. Wait, Mrs. Garcia might want to see you. She's always talking about Mrs. Thompson's grandson. Mrs. Garcia was a tiny woman in her 70s who had lived in the building longer than anyone else. When she saw Marcus, she immediately burst into tears and pulled him into a fierce hug. Mijo, look how handsome you've grown. Your grandmother was so proud of you. They sat in Mrs. Garcia's cluttered apartment while she told him stories about his grandmother that he had never heard. How Sarah had quietly paid for groceries when families were struggling. How she had taught English to new immigrants in the building. How she had organized Christmas parties for the children when their parents couldn't afford gifts. She never told me about any of this, Marcus said. That was Sarah's way. She didn't help people for recognition. She helped because it was right. Mrs. Garcia studied Marcus's face. You look different. More confident. Things must be going well for you. Marcus thought about how to answer that question. My life has changed a lot recently. I found out some things about my family that I never knew before. Good things. Complicated things. But I think they're leading to good things. Mrs. Garcia patted his hand. Your grandmother always said you were destined for something special. She said you had a good heart like hers, but also ambition like your father. Marcus's head snapped up. She talked about my father? Not often, and never by name. But sometimes, when she was very tired or worried, she would say things. She missed him, I think. Missed the man he could have been if he had made different choices. Mrs. Garcia went to an old photo album and pulled out a picture Marcus had never seen before. It showed his grandmother as a young woman, standing next to a tall man with dark hair and serious eyes. They were both smiling, but there was something sad in their expressions. She gave me this picture years ago when she was cleaning out some old things. Said it was from a long time ago, before things went wrong. Marcus studied the photo. The man looked like an older version of himself, and Marcus realized with a shock that this must be Richard Ashworth as a young man. But who was with him in the picture? It wasn't Sarah. This woman was shorter, with light hair and delicate features. Do you know who this woman is? Mrs. Garcia squinted at the photo. Sarah called her the girl who got away. I think maybe she was engaged to your father before everything fell apart. Elizabeth. This was Elizabeth Morrison as a young woman, standing next to the man who would eventually break her heart and send her fleeing to California. Marcus stared at the photo, studying Elizabeth's face. She was beautiful in the way that young women of that era were expected to be, perfectly groomed, modest, smiling sweetly at the camera. But there was intelligence in her eyes, and a hint of steel in her jaw that suggested she was stronger than she appeared. This was the woman he would be meeting in a few days, the woman his father had charged him with making amends to. Looking at her young, hopeful face, Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility more heavily than ever. Can I have this picture? He asked Mrs. Garcia. Of course, Mijo. I think your grandmother would want you to have it. As Marcus walked back to his truck, the photo tucked safely in his wallet, he reflected on how much his understanding of his family had changed in just 1 week. His father hadn't been a cold, calculating businessman who abandoned his family for money. He had been a young man who made terrible mistakes and spent the rest of his life trying to atone for them. His grandmother hadn't been just a simple seamstress raising an orphan grandchild. She had been a woman carrying the weight of family secrets and lost love, trying to build a good life from the ashes of her broken dreams. And Elizabeth Morrison hadn't been just a footnote in his father's story. The Ashworth Industries headquarters occupied 43 floors of a gleaming glass tower in the heart of the city's financial district. As Marcus stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building that now belonged to him, he felt like David facing Goliath. The security guards, executive assistants, and hundreds of employees inside had no idea that their new owner had been working construction jobs just days before. Marcus entered through the revolving doors and approached the reception desk, where a professional-looking woman in her 30s smiled at him politely. Good morning. How can I help you? Hi, I'm Marcus Thompson. I'm here to meet with the executive team. The receptionist's smile faltered slightly as she looked at Marcus's simple khakis and button-down shirt. He had left his expensive funeral suit at home, feeling more comfortable in clothes that didn't make him feel like he was playing dress-up. I'm sorry, do you have an appointment? I think so. I'm the new owner. The woman's eyes widened, and she quickly made a phone call. Within minutes, a tall man in an expensive suit emerged from the elevator and approached them. Mr. Thompson, I'm Robert Chun, the Chief Operating Officer. We've been expecting you. He extended his hand with a warm smile. Welcome to Ashworth Industries. Robert led Marcus to a private elevator that went directly to the 43rd floor executive offices. As they rose, Robert provided a quick overview of the company's operations. We're involved in commercial real estate, residential development, property management, and construction. We have offices in 12 cities and employ about 8,000 people worldwide. Your father built something remarkable here. The executive floor was a study in understated luxury. Marble floors, mahogany paneling, and original artwork created an atmosphere of power and success. But what struck Marcus most was how quiet it was, the hushed tones and careful movements of people who understood they were in the presence of serious money. Robert led Marcus to a large conference room where 6 other executives were waiting. As introductions were made, Marcus tried to remember each name and role, but he felt overwhelmed by the flood of information. There was Sarah Chun, whom he had met at the funeral, along with her brother Robert. Margaret Walsh, the chief financial officer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s. David Kim, head of legal affairs. Jennifer Martinez, who ran human resources. Thomas Brennan, who oversaw construction operations. And Patricia O'Connor, who managed public relations. We've prepared a presentation to bring you up to speed on our current operations, Margaret said, gesturing to a stack of folders and a large screen at the front of the room. For the next 3 hours, Marcus was bombarded with financial reports, development projects, and strategic plans. The numbers were staggering. The company generated over $5 billion in revenue annually, with a net profit of nearly $800 million last year. Your father was very hands-on with major decisions, Robert explained. He reviewed every project over $50 million personally. But he also gave us significant autonomy to run our day-to-day operations. Marcus studied a chart showing the company's charitable giving. This says you donated almost $80 million last year. That's 10% of your profits. Your father believed strongly in giving back, Sarah added. He said that wealth was meaningless if it wasn't used to help others. As the presentation continued, Marcus began to understand the scope of his inheritance. This wasn't just money sitting in bank accounts. It was a living, growing enterprise that provided jobs for thousands of people and housing for tens of thousands more. What happens if I make a mistake? Marcus asked during a break. What if I make a decision that loses money or hurts the company? The executives exchanged glances. Margaret spoke up first. Mr. Thompson, your father made plenty of mistakes over the years. What made him successful wasn't that he never failed. It was that he learned from his failures and surrounded himself with people who could help him make better decisions. We're all here to support you, Robert added. None of us want to see this company fail. We've all invested our careers in building what your father started. After the morning presentation, Marcus asked for some time alone to process everything he had learned. Robert showed him to his father's office, a spacious room on the corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The office had been preserved exactly as Richard Ashworth had left it. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, surrounded by leather chairs and bookcases filled with business journals and real estate law books. But what caught Marcus's attention were the personal touches, a small collection of photographs that his father had kept on his desk. Most of the photos were of Marcus himself, taken from a distance over the years. There he was as a child playing in his grandmother's yard, as a teenager graduating from high school, as a young man in his construction worker's hard hat. His father had documented his entire life from afar, creating a gallery of the son he couldn't openly acknowledge. But there was another photo that surprised Marcus, a picture of his grandmother as an elderly woman, sitting on a park bench feeding pigeons. She looked peaceful and content, unaware that she was being photographed. At the bottom of the frame, someone had written, "Sarah, still beautiful at 75. Marcus sat in his father's chair and tried to imagine Richard Ashworth sitting in this same spot, looking at these photos and thinking about the family he had lost. The loneliness must have been overwhelming, knowing that success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. His contemplation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Thomas Brennan, the construction operations manager, peeked in hesitantly. "Mr. Thompson, do you have a minute? There's something I wanted to discuss with you privately." Marcus gestured for him to enter and sit down. Thomas was probably in his early 60s, with graying hair and hands that looked like they had done real work before he moved into management. "I wanted to tell you something about your father that might not be in any of those reports," Thomas said. "About 20 years ago, we had a project go bad. A residential development in Ohio that ran into environmental problems. Cost the company about $40 million. Marcus nodded, wondering where this was going. "Your father called me into his office and asked who was responsible for the mistakes that led to the cost overruns. I told him it was my fault. I had approved shortcuts that turned out to be illegal when the environmental regulations changed." Thomas shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. "I expected to be fired, maybe even sued. But, instead, your father said something I'll never forget. He said, 'Thomas, I hired you for your expertise, not your perfection. What are you going to do differently next time?' He didn't fire you? Not only did he not fire me, he sent me to a 6-month environmental management course at his own expense. He said he'd rather have someone who had learned from their mistakes than someone who had never made any." Marcus felt a surge of pride in his father. That sounds like the man I'm learning he was. There's more, Thomas continued. That environmental cleanup in Ohio? Your father could have fought it in court, maybe gotten out of paying for it. But he said the right thing to do was fix the damage and make sure it never happened again, regardless of the legal requirements. How much did it cost? The cleanup? Another $60 million. But that's not the point. The point is that your father cared more about doing the right thing than protecting his profit margin. That's the kind of leader he was. And that's the kind of company culture he built here. After Thomas left, Marcus spent the afternoon walking around the building and meeting employees. He visited the accounting department, the legal team, the construction planning office, and the customer service center. Everywhere he went, people shared stories about Richard Ashworth that painted a picture of a demanding but fair boss who genuinely cared about his employees. In the evening, Marcus had dinner with his grandfather James, who had driven down from Ohio to spend a few days in the city. They met at a small restaurant near Marcus's apartment, far from the corporate towers and luxury establishments that Richard Ashworth had frequented. "How was your first day as a billionaire?" James asked with a wry smile. "Overwhelming," Marcus admitted. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me there's been a mistake, that I'm not qualified for this." "Son, nobody's ever qualified to inherit billions of dollars. The only qualification that matters is whether you'll use it responsibly." Marcus told his grandfather about the executives he had met and the company operations he was learning about. James listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood business better than Marcus had expected. "Your grandmother would be proud," James said when Marcus finished. "She always said you had the intelligence to handle whatever life threw at you. I wish she were here to see this. I wish she could have reconciled with Richard before she died." James was quiet for a moment. Maybe she did in her own way. Forgiving someone doesn't always require talking to them. Sometimes it just requires letting go of the anger. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing by trying to find Elizabeth Morrison?" "I think you're doing what your father asked you to do. But more than that, you're doing what your heart tells you is right. That's what Sarah raised you to do." The next morning, Marcus flew to San Jose to meet Elizabeth Morrison Brennan. He had spoken to her twice more on the phone, and she had agreed to meet him at the ad. Been a real person with her own dreams and disappointments. Someone who deserved more than an apology delivered 60 years too late by the son of the man who had hurt her. But perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps there was still time to heal these old wounds, to bring some peace to the people his father's choices had affected. Perhaps that was the real inheritance Richard Ashworth had left him, not billions of dollars, but the opportunity to right the wrongs of the past. As Marcus drove through the city toward his small apartment one last time, he made a mental note to start looking for a new place to live. The construction worker's life was behind him now. Tomorrow, he would begin learning how to be a billionaire. But tonight, he would pack the few belongings that mattered to him and say goodbye to the simple life he had known. The boy who had grown up in poverty was gone forever. In his place was a man with unlimited resources and unlimited responsibilities, carrying forward a legacy of both great wealth and great love. The real work of his inheritance was just beginning. One forever. In his place was a young man with unlimited resources and unlimited responsibilities, carrying forward a legacy of both great wealth and great regret. As Marcus drove through the city streets toward his small apartment, he made a mental list of phone calls he needed to make. His boss at the construction company, to formally resign. His grandfather James, to tell him about the inheritance and invite him to the funeral. And, eventually, Elizabeth Morrison, to begin the process of making amends for sins he had never committed but was now obligated to address. The old Marcus would have been terrified by such overwhelming changes. But this new version of himself, armed with the knowledge of his father's love and his grandmother's strength, felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had inherited more than money. He had inherited a chance to right the wrongs of the past and build something better for the future. And, for the first time in his life, Marcus Thompson felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. How'd his life? His grandmother's sadness and secrecy. The feeling he had always had that someone was watching over him. Richard Ashworth hadn't abandoned his sister or his son. He had spent his entire life trying to make up for one terrible mistake, loving them both from a distance and waiting for the day when the truth could finally be revealed. Marcus carefully packed everything back into the metal box and walked toward the house. Nancy and Tom were waiting on the back porch with worried expressions. "Are you all right, dear?" Nancy asked. "You've been out there for hours." Marcus looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the dark sky. "Yes," he said slowly. "I think I'm going to be just fine." He had a lot of phone calls to make, a lawyer to visit, and a grandfather to meet. His life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. But for the first time since his grandmother's death, Marcus felt like he truly belonged somewhere, like he was part of something bigger than himself. The boy who had inherited just $1 was about to discover that he had actually inherited something far more valuable, a family legacy of love, forgiveness, and second chances. As he got back into his truck for the long drive home, Marcus looked back at the old oak tree one more time. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of claiming his real inheritance. But tonight, he was content to carry with him the knowledge that he had never been alone, that he had always been loved, and that the best treasures in life were often hidden in the most unexpected places.